Secretary of State Marco Rubio went on a bizarre self-promotion tour this week in which he crowned himself a free speech champion.
So much for being here with sharing for the American people a very momentous day in the history of the State Department and the U.S. government in restoring free speech and America's role as the beacon of free speech. Something very historic transpired today. Could you tell the American people what that was?
Well, we ended government-sponsored censorship in the United States through the State Department. And
that's an amazing thing to say, as the Trump administration has launched what's the greatest assault on free speech in recent history.
You know, we're going to get rid of these people, and we're going to continue to do it. So when we identify lunatics like these, we take away their student visa. No one's entitled to a student visa. The press covers student visas like there's some sort of birthright. No, a student visa is like me inviting you into my home. If you come into my home and put all kinds of crap on my couch, I'm going to kick you out of my house. And so, you know, that's what we're doing with our country, thanks to the president.
Jenin Younes is a lawyer who has opposed censorship from both the political left and the political right, and she explains why Marco Rubio's new self-declared status as a free speech champion is both shocking and laughable. First, thanks so much for coming today.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
So I want to start with this. You're one of the lawyers who took on the Biden censorship industrial complex, and that was where the federal government worked with big tech to take down and suppress the free speech of Americans on social media over what the government arbitrarily determined was misinformation or disinformation on the internet, whatever that means. But can you explain your background with that, taking on that censorship regime?
Sure. So I had been opposed to COVID restrictions, which was sort of how I got involved in that area. And then I became aware that a lot of people like me, and even, you know, much more qualified than me to speak on these issues, like epidemiologists Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, the former of whom is currently the NIH director, had been censored on social media when they departed from the government's views, especially on the COVID vaccines, but also other things, including mask mandates and lockdowns. So it became obvious to me and some other people that the government was involved in that censorship after Biden administration officials would make statements sort of threatening to punish the social media companies if they didn't do more to censor misinformation. The companies would escalate censorship and, you know, suspensions, sometimes permanent suspensions. So given the timeline of the statements, it became clear that the government was influencing those policies. So I actually brought a lawsuit in March of 2022 on behalf of 3 Twitter users. Those individuals had been censored on Twitter. They were sort of COVID dissidents. They were not scientists. The lawsuit was dismissed, but that led to my involvement in Missouri versus Biden, which reached the Supreme Court, and I represented Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, and a couple of other people who had been censored.
Right. And I just wanted to ask you that just to show everybody your credibility on these free speech issues, because right now there's a brazen assault in the United States on free speech, mainly pro-Palestinian views. But you're someone who's defended not just views that you agree with, but also views of people who are conservative, who you don't agree with, which shows your credibility. But I want to ask you about.
Well, I will say, sorry, can I just interject on that? Because I actually did agree with the people I was representing mostly on the COVID issues, although some of them said, I wouldn't say I agreed with every statement, but I agreed with it sort of generally. But there were also parts of the lawsuit that were about the 2020 election and the Hunter Biden laptop story. And that's not, you know, those aren't topics on which I do agree. And I'm not a political conservative. I don't think Trump won the election in 2020, and I didn't wish he won.
Right. And, you know, what you're saying, I think, is very true, because it was conservatives on the right who objected the loudest to censorship under the Biden regime or under the Biden administration. But today, that same group who were just victims of censorship 4 years ago are demanding even more censorship under Trump, in this case against their political enemies, who are really just Israel's political enemies. So what do you make of that tribal dynamic where people just seem to cheer on censorship every 4 years, depending on which political faction is in charge? Has that surprised you at all?
It has. I knew that people tend to be a little bit hypocritical on this subject to a degree. I didn't realize it would be so brazen and so obvious, and I thought perhaps that conservatives had learned from their own having been censored by the government. But I was disturbed and unpleasantly surprised to see that a lot of the very same people who decried the censorship that occurred under the Biden regime are championing it under this regime. And of course, people never say, I'm pro censorship. They come up with reasons. Under the Biden administration, it was, well, if people heard misinformation about the vaccine, they may not get it, and then they might die, and that would be effectively killing people. And now it's, you're a terrorist supporter, so it's fine to censor you, or you're a guest in our country. We're hearing that a lot because right now, at least, most of the censorship or most of the punishments are being doled out to non-citizens in the form of ICE detention and possible deportation. So while you're a guest in our country, you don't have First Amendment rights, which is not true. Total misreading of the First Amendment or non-reading of the First Amendment, which is probably a more likely scenario. It's disturbing.
Well, I want to get into those cases, and I think we should start with the deportations. Hundreds of students at this point have had their visas revoked, as you say, not for any crimes that they've committed, but for merely expressing views that the government doesn't like, namely support and sympathy for Palestinians and criticism of Israel. And one case is this tough student, PhD student, Ramezia Ozturk, who, to justify her deportation, the State Department cites writing an op-ed, participating in protest movements, which apparently harass students. I haven't seen any of this, but we constantly hear it. Taking over buildings, and just her general support for Hamas, whatever that means. Jenin, how do you expect the courts will react to this? And what would allowing the State Department to arbitrarily deport permanent and legal residents over their op-eds they write do to our First Amendment in the United States?
Okay, so I have so much to say about this. I'll try to keep it succinct, but there's a lot. Okay, so first of all, it's very important for people to remember what the text of the First Amendment says, which is Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It is not about the speaker's immigration status. It's a restraint on government. The framers did not recognize any kind of difference, and for good reason. They understood that the principles underlying the First Amendment are that government is not in a special position to judge what's true or what's false. The government is often driven by the wrong motives when it is allowed to censor, and so we don't want to give government that power. That debate, discussion are the best ways to resolve policy questions of the current time. So that's, from a purely legal standpoint, it's obvious to me that if any law allows someone to be deported purely for their speech or their views, then it's inconsistent with the First Amendment and it should be struck down. What is happening in these cases is a lot of people like Rubio are conflating the conduct of unnamed others with the person at issue. So they're saying, well, students at Columbia took over this building, and Ozturk is not accused of doing that, neither is Mahmoud Khalil. They've just said, well, other students did that at Columbia. Ozturk wasn't even at Columbia, she was at Tufts. So it's, they're kind of treating it as though all the students who oppose what Israel is doing in Gaza are sort of one mass, and they're all responsible for each other's actions, and so they can all be deported. This is obviously completely ridiculous, and it's not consistent with any kind of principles of law, whether it's in immigration or criminal context or any. It's about individual responsibility, individual guilt. You're not guilty of any crime, or even speech. Just because one person said something anti-Semitic at a protest, which is still First Amendment protected speech, but let's, for the sake of argument, assume that there's some anti-Semitic speech that's First Amendment protected, but obviously not desirable. That doesn't mean everybody at the protests engaged in that speech. And so there's this conflation of what an individual did with what some people maybe in the group did. So that's another issue. But the implications of this are just completely chilling. If the philosophy that they're using basically is saying that there's this obscure provision of immigration law that allows for somebody to be deported, whether or not they have a green card or visa, whether it's green card, visa, whatever, that allows them to be deported if they're deemed to pose a threat to our foreign policy. And what Rubio is saying is that it's our policy to combat anti-Semitism abroad. He's conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And so if you oppose what Israel is doing, then you are conflicting with our goals. And so therefore you can be deported. That's a completely ridiculous interpretation of this statute, which might be unconstitutional anyway. So as for what the courts are doing, it's complicated. No, there has not been any federal judicial decision on this issue yet. I am trying to remain optimistic that the courts will do the right thing here, that they'll find that either that the statute is unconstitutional or that it must be read in order to limit it to conduct that is something more than speech. So just your speech, your views, involvement in protests can't be the basis for finding that you pose a threat to our foreign policy. So people were sort of perturbed because last week the immigration judge in Mahmoud Khalil's case found that he could be deported, but people should not, that is really not even close to the end of the road. So he has two cases. He has his immigration law case, which was never likely, and that was never likely to be the avenue for relief for him because, first of all, immigration judges they're administrative, they're part of the executive branch, they're not independent. They tend not to be very good. The government purposely shipped him to Louisiana to get a Louisiana immigration judge because they're probably the worst there. But he is challenging the constitutionality of his detention and deportation in federal court, basically saying that the statute is unconstitutional or it's unconstitutional applied to him. And so that case is still ongoing. And basically, people have faulted the immigration judge, and I'm not an immigration lawyer, so I don't want to say for certain, but the statute appears to sort of unilaterally give the Secretary of State the authority to make the determination as to whether someone can be removed under it. So it seemed to me that what she's saying is, look, the statute doesn't give me authority to question the Secretary of State's decision here. If you think the statute is unconstitutional, you can go fight that in federal court, which he's doing. So that was always the avenue that was more likely to provide relief here.
If you talk to government defenders, they'll say the following. The argument is this, that people are here on visas and that they have to behave like guests, that they can't object to our government's policies. But as you mentioned, these constitutional protections like free speech and like due process do apply to everyone on American soil, regardless of if you're a naturalized citizen or not. If they didn't, what would that mean for government critics, not just on the left currently, but right-wing dissidents on foreign visas who are critical of Democrats? And how would that play out under future Democratic administrations? Has anyone really thought ahead?
No, I mean, the implications of this are extraordinary, and I don't think people really have thought through this. What that means is that essentially, if the government can just remove you at any time because it doesn't like your views, nobody can have any assurance of stability in this country. Lots of people marry non-citizens, and when you marry a non-citizen, my father did that. She got a green card, and then she became a citizen. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil has a child on the way. He's married to an American citizen. Should children whose parents have green cards and haven't yet attained citizenship, they have to worry that the administration changes and then disagrees with their parents' view and can deport them out of the country? There is no precedent whatsoever for treating non-citizens this way. And I mean, people should remember during COVID, there were a number of non-citizens. I actually had a very good friend who was here on a visa from Australia. He worked for the Australian. He wrote lots of articles contesting lockdowns, vaccine mandates, mask mandates. Under this theory, the government could have said it's our policy to combat COVID all over the world. And by coming here and writing articles questioning our strategy, you're endangering our policy of lockdowns and mask mandates and that sort of stuff to fight COVID. We're going to get rid of you. This is really, it's bad for people. It's bad for America. Like, we want people to be able to come here and to have some sense of stability. If they don't do anything wrong, if they came here legally, they're on a visa or on a green card, that they can voice their views. I myself, I want to hear the perspectives of people from all over the world. I think that makes for a healthier society. I think I want to learn from people who've lived through different things, who might have a different perspective than I have. This like idea that you're a guest in our country, so if you have views that offend me, get out. That's completely insane. And I saw like Megyn Kelly was making that point with Glenn Greenwald. I mean, who she says, well, I don't like Mahmoud Khalil's views, basically, so he should be kicked out of the country. I mean, who gets to decide that? I do like his views. Like, it's so arrogant to think you get to make this decision, and or that the executive, just because he, it's ridiculous.
Let me ask you this. It's kind of related because so often when we grant the government new powers supposedly designed to counter foreign or fringe threats, those powers almost always end up targeting American citizens. That was the case with the Patriot Act and mass surveillance, and it's kind of a general rule in Washington. Do you anticipate that's what will happen here with the Trump administration's deportation scheme for Israel's critics, that it will be expanded to target Americans, not just permanent residents?
On my dark days, I do. I think what's most likely is they'll go after naturalized citizens and try to find ways to strip them of their citizenship. There was a pretty well-known case of a woman named, I forgot her first name, Rasmea Odeya, I think, in Chicago. She was Palestinian. They basically wanted to get rid of her because she was extremely pro-Palestine. So they found something on her citizenship application and basically stripped her of her citizenship. I think that's what they're going to do. It's very, very difficult to go after natural-born citizens. Now, of course, they could, and that's my point. If you can deem support for Palestinians to be a national security threat or effectively terrorism, if the courts buy that, then we're in trouble, because you can similarly make arguments under like the material support for terrorism laws. Of course, this is a completely ludicrous definition of terrorism, and I hope courts reject it, as they should. But I can't say that I'm not afraid.
Let me ask you about that because you mentioned something very interesting, which is the tendency of courts to recognize the government's ability to basically subvert the Constitution if it means protecting national security. That came up recently with the TikTok case, where they basically said, yeah, you can ban this app because it's a Chinese propaganda app. We'll just accept your arguments that the algorithm is tainted and pushing propaganda, whatever, and we'll allow you to do that. Do you anticipate that more of those decisions will come in, which basically just subvert all of our constitutional rights in the name of national security?
Um, do I? Yeah, I think it's likely. I don't really love making predictions. With this specific issue, it's a little easier because it seems to me the logical next step. It's also what the plan, Project 2025, Project Esther, basically that is the plan, to start by deporting in order to suppress speech that's critical of Israel, to start with deportations of non-citizens and then move to ways to punish citizens. Um, I am not. I haven't thought that far ahead, to be totally honest. I'm not. I'm not sure what that would look like, but I do. Yes, I think some form of national security law will be used.
Well, let me move on from deportations and talk about how the Trump administration is trying to wrestle control of our universities just generally. The Trump administration has revoked federal funds for all universities which failed to adopt its standards of hate speech enforcement against pro-Palestinian views, and it sent letters to a number of schools outlining the steps that they must take to receive those funds in the future, like adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and placing some departments under academic receivership, government control of the curriculum. Is there any constitutional basis for the federal government coercing universities to adopt speech codes, in this case around Israel and U.S. foreign policy? Things you'd probably want to debate at university campuses.
Um, no, the federal government cannot do this. And people keep making the argument on social media that, well, you're not entitled to federal funding, but there's very clear case law saying that the federal government cannot condition its funding on the suppression of certain viewpoints. So once it decides to give the funds, it can't say, well, you only get the funds if if you suppress pro-Palestine viewpoints or suppress pro-Israel viewpoints. Just it's completely unconstitutional. So I hope this stuff will be challenged. I do, I'm kind of against universities getting federal funding, to be honest, like from a policy perspective. I don't think it's good for anybody. So maybe this will be a come to Jesus moment where the universities decide to become independent again. And I really think that's probably the best thing for everybody.
I have one more for you. The Department of Homeland Security announced last week that it's going to start monitoring social media to scan for any visa holders who criticize Israel. And I also see many right wingers defending that. But I thought that conservatives were against DHS spying. Jim Jordan and Mike Johnson spoke out very vocally against it in 2022. They were saying things like DHS will monitor your Twitter account, but won't secure the border, which seems like exactly what's happening now. And it's really amazing because opposition to government surveillance was something of a staple of right-wing discourse for the past 4 years. But now they've embraced those tools to target Israel's critics in the United States. I'm wondering what you make of that.
I mean, just like everything else I've said, it's complete and total hypocrisy. It's utterly inconsistent. They're trying to frame it as something different because this is about getting foreigners out of the country that don't have the right, that pose a threat to us somehow. But again, our history, tradition, our First Amendment understands that we don't punish people. The government doesn't punish people for having views that differ from the government's. That's just not constitutional. It's also not consistent with the principles underlying the First Amendment. So it's just complete hypocrisy. And I mean, this obviously has implications for non-citizens. If they're scanning social media, they don't know offhand who's a citizen and who's not. That means they're monitoring everybody. And this is sort of government interference that's really disturbing and should really chill people.
I have one final question for you, just about what you anticipate might be the backlash to this censorship. I mean, one consequence of having the federal government exert control over the internet and manipulate our information system over issues like COVID, the 2020 election, Hunter Biden's laptop, the war in Ukraine, is that fewer and fewer people believe the official narratives that they're being steered toward, and more people actually dissent and distrust from those power factions that the censorship was designed to protect in the first place and shield from criticism. And that seems to be the case under the Israel lobby censorship regime as well. I mean, every day, more and more people are censored and deported for their criticisms of Israel. Yet the efforts seem to be counterproductive because at the same time, we have these new polls from Gallup and Pew, which show that the number of Americans who sympathize with the Palestinians is at all-time highs, and disillusionment with Israel is as well. I'm wondering if this is something that you've noticed as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that was one of the reasons the framers included the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. I mean, one of numerous reasons, but they also understood that censorship doesn't work, right? Like when it's just not, when people say you can't say this or you can't think this or you can't hear about this, most people are like, well, wait a second, I kind of want to hear, wasn't that interested before, but now I am. So I do think that that's probably, it's actually probably increasing people's knowledge of what's going on in Palestine, because if they're like, wait, why can't we talk about this? It's hard to say exactly what the cause and effect is. I think probably changing public opinion on this, increasing, diminishing support for Israel among Americans is probably causing some desperation that might be prompting the censorship efforts. It could also be, kind of feeding each other. It doesn't seem to me that the people who are imposing these policies have thought very far ahead, but that would be kind of normal for politicians. They don't, and they also, they don't really care because it's just about winning the next election or getting high favorability ratings right now. They don't really tend to think long term. But I do think that ultimately, of course, this will backfire on the people who are doing this. But it's very scary right now for everybody, I think, who's a pro-Palestine advocate, a Palestine advocate.
Well, thank you so much for coming today and speaking with me. It really means a lot. Where should people go if they want to support your work?
Well, I am on Twitter. That's the best place to find me right now. At Jenin Younes Esquire, JeninYounesEsq. I also have a podcast called Previously Prohibited with my co-host Melissa Whitty. So subscribe, whatever. Find us there.